Ramón Nonnato, Suicide by Miguel de Unamuno. When, after knocking relentlessly at the door of his master's room, the servant was finally forced to break it open, he found his master lying there, pale and cold in bed. A thin trickle of blood seeped from his right temple, and beside him lay that portrait of a woman, the one he always carried with him, almost like a talisman, the one he would spend endless hours contemplating. It had happened the evening before, on a grey autumn day, just as the light was fading. Ramón Nonnato had shot himself. That afternoon he had been seen, as was his habit, walking alone along the riverbank near its mouth, watching the waters carry away the yellow leaves that drifted down from the poplars, swept away forever, never to return. For the ones that would come back in the next spring, the spring I will never see, the one that will return with new birds to the trees, those will be different leaves, he had thought. When news of the suicide spread, there was only a single, pitying murmur, "Poor Ramón Nonnato," and there were those who added, it was his dead father who killed him. Only a few days before taking his own life, Nonnato had paid off his final debt with the proceeds from the sale of the last estate that remained to him, the last of the many properties he had inherited from his father. It was his mother's ancestral home. Before parting with it, he had spent an entire day there, alone, mourning his desolation, the absence of any living memory to hold on to, clutching an old portrait of his mother in his hands. This was the same portrait he had always carried close to his chest, an image of hope that, for him, had always been a relic of the past, never of the future. The poor man had squandered the fortune his father had left him in reckless financial speculations, in wild, desperate attempts to increase his wealth, to make it vast and unassailable, all while living a life of extreme modesty, bordering on poverty, depriving himself of nearly every comfort. He spent only the bare minimum to maintain a discreet sense of decorum. Whatever remained he gave away in charity and acts of kindness. For while Ramón Nonnato was miserly when it came to himself, he was extraordinarily generous, lavish, even when it came to others, especially to those who had suffered at the hands of his father. The reason behind his actions was simple. He had sought to multiply his fortune, to make it immense, and then to dedicate it to some great noble cause, a work that would serve the greater good, that would redeem his wealth from the sin of its origins. He had never believed that small acts of charity were enough, nor that he could atone for his father's misdeeds simply by compensating those he had wronged. One cannot gather back water that has already been spilled. He carried in his mind, fixed and unshakable, the final words his father had spoken to him before dying. "What pains me, my son, is that this fortune, so painstakingly built, so meticulously structured by me, this wealth so carefully distributed, which is, whether you believe it or not, a true work of art, will crumble in your hands. You have not inherited my spirit. You have no love for money, nor any understanding of business. I must admit I was wrong about you." Fortunately, thought Nonnato upon hearing his father's last words, because, in truth, his father had failed to pass on to him that hard, joyless love of money, that fervour for business, that preference for gaining 3 through legal deception rather than earning 4 honestly. And yet, poor Nonnato had been the one to plead his father's endless lawsuits, his unpaid attorney, of course. As his father's lawyer, he had been forced to descend into the deepest recesses of the usurer's den, those damp, suffocating shadows that further darkened his soul, trapping it in an inescapable servitude. He could not break free. How could he resist that cutting, predatory gaze? Those were bleak, miserable years. The years of his legal studies, a profession he despised, forced upon him by his father. Every summer, after enduring another dark term of study, he would retreat to his coastal village for vacation. But even there, his father's grip followed him. He was lodged in a wretched house belonging to one of his father's debtors, just another way to extract more interest from the man's loan. And so Nonnato would wander alone to the seashore, seeking solace in the vast solitude of the ocean, trying to forget the sorrows of the land. The sea had always called to him like a great consoling mother. Seated upon a rock wrapped in seaweed, he would gaze at that portrait of his mother, the only source of tenderness in his life, and he would imagine that the sighing lull of the waves, was the cradle song he had never been granted as a child. He had longed to be a sailor, to escape his father's house, to cultivate the solitude of his soul, but his father, who needed a lawyer to twist the law in his favour, had forced him into legal studies, stealing the sea from him. Thus, his student years had been a slow suffocation. Not even the consolation of memories warmed those years, for his youth had passed like one long winter's night in a desert of ice. Alone, always alone with that father who barely spoke to him, except to discuss his sordid business dealings. And now and then, the old man would say, "Everything I do for you. Primarily for you, almost solely for you. I want you to be rich, very rich, immensely rich, so rich that you can marry the daughter of the wealthiest man among those pompous aristocrats who look down on us." But the boy had always known it was a lie. He was nothing but an excuse, a justification, his father whispered to himself, to ease the burden of his own conscience, to mask his greed and usury. It was in that gloomy, loveless youth that he first found his mother's portrait and began to worship it. His father, for his part, never spoke of her. And the poor boy, hearing his classmates talk about their mothers, tried to imagine what his own might have been like. He questioned in vain the old servant, a dry, severe woman, his father's confidante, the one who had taken him from the arms of his wet nurse, whom he had never seen again. That stern, tight-lipped woman had never sung to him, and yet it was her voice that echoed in his earliest, most distant memories of childhood. Childhood! He had never had one. His childhood was one long, grey and bitter day, stretched over several years, because every day was the same, and every hour of every day was just like the one before it. Even school was no less oppressive than home. There his classmates tormented him with cruel jokes, as only children can, mocking his father's ruthless dealings, and the day they saw him cry after calling him the usurer's son, they only laughed harder. His wet nurse had left as soon as she could, because her wages had never been paid in full. That was how the usurer exacted his debts. Instead of paying the woman for feeding the helpless infant at her breast, he had deducted her wages from the money her husband owed him. Ramón Nonnato had been pulled from the still-warm corpse of his mother, who had died just before giving birth to him, 42 years before the day he took his own life. Perhaps that was why he had been born with suicide already imprinted on his soul. His poor mother! How many times in those final days of her life had she clung to the hope that the long-awaited child might be a ray of sunlight in that cold, wretched home, that he might change the heart of that terrible man. And at the very least, she thought, I will no longer be alone in the world. When I sing to my baby, I will not hear the dreadful clinking of money in that accursed room of secrets, and who knows, perhaps he will change. She dreamed of taking the child on bright days down to the shore to nurse him before the great heaving breast of the sea, her song joining the eternal lullaby that had soothed so many sorrows of the weary human race. But how had she come to be married to that man? Even she did not know. It had been arranged by her family, by her father, whose dealings with the man who would become her husband had always been murky, secretive. She suspected something terrible, but she did not want to know. She remembered that one day, after several days in which her mother's eyes had remained red and swollen from weeping, her father had called her into the solemn chamber, the room where grave matters were decided. Listen to me, my daughter. My salvation, our family's salvation, depends on you. Without your sacrifice, we will not only be ruined, but disgraced. Command me, father, she had answered. You must marry Anastasio, my business partner. The poor girl had stood there, shaking from head to toe, silent, and her father, taking her silence as consent, had added, Thank you, my child, thank you. I expected nothing less from you. Yes, this sacrifice. Sacrifice, she had repeated just to say something. Oh, yes, my dear, you do not know him. You do not know him as I do.